Silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes it is the stillness that follows a forbidden question. The kind that echoes long after the voice that asked it has been silenced. What if the ideas once condemned as heresy were never false at all? What if they were simply too free? In the earliest centuries of the Christian era, before altars became thrones and belief learned to wear armor, spirituality moved quietly among ordinary people. It was not owned, it was not standardized, it was felt. Stories were shared by firelight, not enforced by decree. Teachings traveled through memory, symbol, and lived experience. The sacred was something encountered, not something regulated. Imagine a world where faith was not a contract, but a relationship, where meaning unfolded through reflection, prayer, and inner listening, where no single voice claimed the authority to speak for the divine. In those early gatherings, difference was not danger. Interpretation was not rebellion. To seek was not to sin. Ancient wisdom traditions across cultures understood this instinctively. Laozi wrote that the moment truth is fixed into language, it begins to lose its living essence. The Buddha warned against clinging even to teachings meant to liberate. These were not systems built on obedience, but on awareness. Yet power has always been uneasy around anything it cannot contain. Over time, a subtle shift began. Diversity of thought, once natural, started to feel threatening. Questions became uncomfortable. Inner authority challenged external control. And slowly, almost invisibly, the atmosphere changed. A word emerged that would reshape history: heresy. At first, it carried no shadow. It meant choice, a direction taken, a school of thought among many. There were no punishments attached, no flames waiting at the end of inquiry, only difference. But ask yourself this: when does choice become a threat? Psychology offers a clue. Systems built on certainty require predictability. Viktor Frankl observed that when meaning arises from within, it resists domination. An individual who trusts inner experience does not depend on permission. That independence unsettles any structure seeking permanence through control. And so, the question that would shatter empires was not shouted, it was whispered. Who decides what is true as footsteps gather in the distance? Measured, deliberate, authoritative. You can sense what is coming next, a turning point where faith will trade freedom for security, mystery for definition, and silence for law. Once that line is crossed, belief will never be the same again. Before doctrine had a name, before belief was measured, before creeds were memorized, before the sacred was confined to approved language, spirituality moved through the world like a quiet current. It had no official shape, no central authority, no final interpretation. It lived in stories remembered rather than texts enforced, in gestures and symbols rather than rigid instruction. Early followers of Jesus did not experience faith as a system. They experienced it as a way of being. Gatherings were intimate, often hidden, formed around shared meals, shared silence, and shared reflection. Meaning was not handed down from above. It emerged between people. The sacred felt close, personal, almost fragile, like something that could disappear if grasped too tightly. In many of these communities, Jesus was not spoken of primarily as an object of worship, but as a living example, a mirror, a symbol of inner transformation. Some understood him as a teacher pointing toward a shift in consciousness, not the founder of an institution. Others spoke of him as a revealer of hidden wisdom, urging listeners to look inward rather than upward. This was not chaos. It was plurality. Across the ancient world, spiritual traditions functioned in a similar way. In the Upanishads, truth is approached through dialogue and inner reflection. In early Buddhist sanghas, teachings were tested through direct experience. Even within Jewish mystical currents, meaning was layered, symbolic, and open-ended. Certainty was rare. Questions were honored. Psychologically, this kind of environment nurtures autonomy. Modern studies on intrinsic motivation show that humans engage more deeply when meaning feels personally discovered rather than externally imposed. Early spiritual life reflected this truth long before science named it. But freedom has a cost. Without centralized authority, belief cannot be controlled. Without fixed doctrine, power has no anchor. As communities grew and spread across regions, their differences became harder to ignore. Stories shifted. Interpretations multiplied. Symbols evolved. To some, this richness felt alive. To others, it felt dangerous. Pause and imagine standing at that crossroads. One path leads toward trust in inner experience, allowing meaning to remain fluid. The other promises stability, unity, and order, but demands submission in return. History shows us which path was chosen. As influence expanded and attention turned toward governance rather than guidance, the question was no longer how to experience truth, but how to define it. And once truth is defined, it can be defended, enforced, protected. In that moment, spirituality began to change its voice. What had once whispered now prepared to speak with authority. When choice became a crime, there was a time when disagreement was not a threat. When differing interpretations of the sacred were simply signs that the mystery was vast enough to hold many voices. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere hardened. What had once been choice began to feel like defiance. The word heresy tells this story better than any chronicle. Its origin is deceptively simple. From the Greek heresis, it meant a selection, a preference, a school of thought. Philosophers used it freely. So did early spiritual communities. To follow a particular understanding was not rebellion, it was participation. Yet language, like belief, does not remain innocent for long. As structures of authority began to form, difference stopped being neutral. A system built on unity cannot easily tolerate variation. The same diversity that once allowed faith to breathe now appeared as fragmentation. And fragmentation in the eyes of emerging power signaled weakness. Psychology explains this shift with unsettling clarity. When a group feels threatened, it tightens its boundaries. Social identity theory shows how communities preserve cohesion by defining outsiders. Once that line is drawn, those who stand on the other side become more than different. They become dangerous. This is how choice transforms into crime. Doubt, once a doorway to insight, was recast as instability. Questioning, once an act of devotion, became suspicion. The inner voice, once trusted, was reframed as temptation. Slowly, obedience replaced curiosity as the highest virtue. Ancient traditions had long warned of this turn. In the Bhagavad Gita, attachment to rigid outcomes blinds wisdom. In the sayings attributed to Jesus in non-canonical traditions, the danger is not error, but blindness to one's own inner light. But such warnings were inconvenient. They could not be standardized. Imagine being among those early seekers as the tone changes. Conversations grow cautious. Words are weighed. Silence becomes safer than sincerity. The fear is subtle at first, but it spreads. Not fear of the divine, but fear of being seen. This was the birth of a new spiritual emotion, anxiety. Not the anxiety of guilt, but the anxiety of deviation, of stepping outside what is acceptable, of being labeled. And once labels appear, they rarely remain symbolic. The transformation of heresy from choice to accusation marked a turning point that cannot be undone. It introduced a logic that would echo for centuries. Truth must be guarded, and those who interpret it differently must be corrected or removed. As this logic takes root, guardians emerge, not guides, but enforcers, not listeners, but judges. And with them comes the first shadow of something far more enduring than belief itself: power. Constantine and the seduction of power. When a persecuted faith steps into the halls of power, something fundamental changes. What once survived in secrecy learns to speak the language of authority. This is the moment where devotion meets ambition, and spirituality begins to wear the garments of empire. For nearly 3 centuries, Christian communities existed on the margins. They gathered quietly, often in fear, shaped by shared vulnerability rather than dominance. Their strength lay in inner conviction, not public control. But history rarely allows movements to remain untouched by power once they become useful. The turning point came with Constantine. In the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was fractured. Civil wars, divided loyalties, and spiritual fragmentation threatened its stability. Constantine, a skilled strategist, understood something essential. An empire needs a unifying story. Christianity, with its growing reach and moral authority, offered exactly that. With the Edict of Milan, persecution ended. Christians were legalized, protected, and soon favored. Temples replaced catacombs. Bishops gained influence. What had once been whispered prayers now echoed in imperial halls. At first, this seemed like liberation. But power rarely gives without taking. The psychology of influence reveals a subtle exchange. When a belief system becomes tied to reward, its inner meaning begins to shift. Faith that once demanded courage now offered security. Belonging became advantageous. Conformity became profitable. Constantine did not convert the empire to spirituality. He converted spirituality into a tool of empire. The sacred was reorganized. Leadership structures mirrored political hierarchies. Unity was no longer spiritual resonance, but administrative necessity. Differences that once coexisted now appeared as risks to order. Ancient voices had warned against this seduction. Marcus Aurelius wrote that power tests character more than hardship. The early followers faced that test on a collective scale, and many did not recognize it until it was too late. Pause and consider the shift. When belief aligns with authority, dissent stops being personal and becomes political. To question doctrine is no longer just to question ideas, but to challenge stability itself. From this moment on, truth would no longer be discovered. It would be declared. Councils would replace conversations. Definitions would replace symbols. And spirituality, once guided by experience, would be shaped by decree. The faith that survived persecution now stood on the threshold of becoming something entirely different. An institution. And institutions do not tolerate uncertainty for long. The birth of orthodoxy. Once power entered the sanctuary, Belief needed structure. What could no longer remain fluid had to be defined. What could not be trusted to individual experience had to be fixed into form. This was the moment orthodoxy was born. Orthodoxy did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a solution. As Christianity expanded across regions, languages, and cultures, interpretations multiplied. Some spoke of Jesus as a mystical guide pointing inward. Others framed him as a cosmic figure. Others still as a moral teacher. Stories differed. Emphases shifted. For those now tasked with maintaining unity, this variety looked less like richness and more like instability. So boundaries were drawn. Councils were convened not in forests or homes, but under the gaze of authority. Debates unfolded, but the outcome was no longer shaped by silence, prayer, or insight alone. It was shaped by consensus, influence, and alignment with imperial needs. Truth became something that could be voted on. Psychologically, this shift marks a transfer of trust. Instead of trusting lived experience, the individual was asked to trust the system. Instead of listening inwardly, one was taught to listen upward. Security replaced sincerity. In many ancient traditions, wisdom was never meant to be uniform. The Dhammapada reminds that no path fits all travelers. The Hebrew prophets argued openly with God. Even Socrates was condemned for asking too many questions. Orthodoxy reversed this pattern. It promised peace through agreement and salvation through sameness. But sameness requires enforcement. Once a standard is set, deviation must be named. Once belief is defined, alternatives must be rejected. Orthodoxy and heresy are not opposites by accident. They are created together. One can't exist without the other. Imagine standing in one of those early councils. Voices rise, arguments circle. Some speak from experience, others from fear of fragmentation. Outside, an empire waits for a decision. Stability demands an answer. And so the mystery is narrowed. Creeds emerge. Language hardens. The sacred is compressed into formulas that can be memorized, recited, and tested. What cannot be measured is dismissed. What cannot be controlled is labeled dangerous. From this point forward, faith is no longer something you explore. It is something you adhere to. And adherence has consequences. Because once belief becomes law, questioning it no longer risks misunderstanding. It risks punishment. The door has quietly closed behind humanity's spiritual imagination. The Gnostic threat. Among the many voices that unsettled the emerging order, none provoked more fear than those who spoke of knowledge found within. They were later grouped under a single name, not because they were unified, but because they were inconvenient. Gnostics. Their central claim was simple and radical. The sacred is not accessed through permission, but through awareness. Truth is not inherited from authority, but recognized through direct insight. The divine is not distant, but present. Already alive within the human being. To those building a hierarchy, this idea was explosive. If the sacred resides within, what need is there for intermediaries? If awakening is personal, what role remains for institutions that claim exclusive access to truth? If inner knowing matters more than outward conformity, then obedience loses its power. From a psychological perspective, this is the ultimate disruption. Systems maintain control by positioning themselves as necessary. Gnostic thought quietly removed that necessity. It did not attack the structure directly. It simply rendered it irrelevant. Texts attributed to these traditions speak in symbols, riddles, and paradoxes. They do not demand belief, they invite recognition. One saying attributed to Jesus declares that the kingdom is not something to wait for, but something to realize. Another suggests that ignorance, not sin, is what binds humanity. Such ideas could not be regulated. Ancient wisdom across cultures echoed this thread. In the Upanishads, realization comes through inner sight, not ritual. Zen masters warned that reliance on forms obscures awakening. Even later thinkers like Jung would argue that wholeness requires confronting the inner world, not suppressing it. For those consolidating authority, these perspectives undermined everything. They could not be standardized. They could not be policed. They could not be enforced. Worst of all, they empowered individuals to trust their own experience. Pause and consider why this is so dangerous to power. A person who trusts inner awareness is difficult to manipulate. Fear loses its grip. Guilt becomes ineffective. Rewards lose their leverage. So the response was not dialogue, but dismissal. These teachings were labeled secretive, elitist, deceptive. Their symbolic language was reframed as confusion. Their emphasis on inner light was accused of arrogance. Over time, the term Gnostic itself became shorthand for threat, not because these ideas destroyed faith, but because they refused to surrender it. And so, quietly at first, the process of erasure began. The first erasures. Erasure rarely begins with fire. It begins with silence. Before texts were burned, they were ignored. Before names were condemned, they were quietly excluded. The first act of suppression is almost always subtle, disguised as discernment, framed as protection rather than violence. As orthodoxy hardened, decisions had to be made about which voices would represent the faith and which would be left behind. Not argued with, not debated, simply removed from memory. Writings that emphasized inner knowledge, symbolic language, or personal revelation were judged unsuitable, too ambiguous, too open, too uncontrollable. So they were set aside. This was not yet a public purge. It was an administrative one. Lists were formed. Texts were categorized. Some were labeled useful, others questionable. A few were deemed dangerous. Over time, these distinctions became permanent. What was copied survived. What was not copied disappeared. History is often shaped less by what is destroyed than by what is no longer transmitted. Psychologically, this kind of erasure is powerful because it reshapes reality without appearing to do so. When certain perspectives vanish, future generations assume they never existed. The absence feels natural. The narrative feels complete. Ancient librarians understood this well. To control knowledge, one does not need to burn every book. One only needs to decide which ones remain visible. Think of how memory works in the human mind. Experiences that are repressed do not vanish. They linger beneath the surface, influencing behavior in unseen ways. Cultures behave similarly. What is buried does not die. It waits. Some of the earliest suppressed texts spoke of divine wisdom as something remembered rather than granted. Others portrayed spiritual figures as guides, not rulers. Some included voices that challenged hierarchy simply by existing. These were not errors. They were alternatives. Alternatives are intolerable to systems built on singular truth. Across traditions, this pattern repeats. In Chinese history, schools of thought were erased to preserve harmony. In medieval philosophy, inconvenient works vanished from curricula. Even modern regimes understand that censorship works best when it feels invisible. Pause and ask yourself, how many ideas have you never encountered, not because they were disproven, but because they were never allowed to reach you? As certain writings disappeared, a narrower version of faith emerged. One with clearer boundaries, clearer authority, fewer questions. What remained felt solid, but something vital was missing. Depth, mystery, plurality. The sacred began to sound more certain but also more distant, less alive, less intimate. These first erasures laid the foundation for everything that followed. Once memory can be curated, belief can be shaped. Once history can be edited, truth can be managed. And when silence proves insufficient, stronger measures inevitably follow. The fire was still to come. Nicaea, engineering God. By the time the council gathered at Nicaea, the question was no longer what people experienced in their hearts, but what they were permitted to believe with their lips. The atmosphere had changed. Faith had entered the realm of administration. In the year 325, bishops arrived from across the empire, summoned not by spiritual urgency, but by imperial command. Constantine presided, not as a theologian, but as an architect of order. The empire needed unity, and unity required agreement. Disagreement, no matter how sincere, had become a liability. At the center of the debate stood a mystery that had once inspired contemplation rather than conflict: the nature of Jesus. Was he fully divine, fully human, or something that defied such categories altogether? Earlier communities had lived comfortably with this ambiguity. Now, ambiguity was unacceptable. Mystery does not serve power well. What unfolded was less a spiritual reckoning and more a negotiation. Language was sharpened, terms were fixed. Concepts that once invited reflection were reduced to precise formulations. Of the same substance became more than theology. It became a boundary. Psychologically, this moment marks a decisive shift. When complexity is replaced by certainty, anxiety temporarily subsides. Clear answers feel safe. But that safety comes at a cost: the suppression of nuance, the dismissal of lived experience, the silencing of inner conflict. The Nicene Creed did not emerge from silence or shared insight. It emerged from pressure, persuasion, and political necessity. Those who resisted were not merely disagreed with, they were condemned. Exile replaced conversation. Compliance replaced understanding. This was unprecedented. For the first time, belief was no longer shaped organically within communities. It was defined centrally and enforced universally. Faith became declarative. One had to state it correctly to belong. Ancient thinkers had warned against this collapse of mystery into formula. Plato argued that ultimate truths cannot be captured fully in words. Jung later observed that when symbols are taken literally, they lose their transformative power. Nicaea did exactly that. It froze symbol into statement. Pause and imagine what was lost in that moment. Not just ideas, but entire ways of relating to the sacred, ways that honored uncertainty, ways that allowed contradiction, ways that trusted inner recognition over external approval. From this point on, spirituality would be guarded by decree. Deviations would no longer be tolerated as differences. They would be treated as threats to order itself. Nicaea did not resolve a debate. It closed it. And once closed, it would never be reopened without consequences. The machinery of dogma was now fully assembled. The psychology of obedience. Once belief was defined, something quieter but far more powerful took hold. Fear no longer needed to be announced. It became internal. The threat was no longer only exile or punishment, but the terror of being wrong in the eyes of an absolute authority. This is where obedience replaces understanding. When doctrine becomes fixed, the individual is no longer invited to explore meaning. They are instructed to accept it. Over time, this creates a psychological shift. Responsibility for truth moves outward. Conscience is outsourced. The inner voice grows uncertain, while external approval becomes the measure of worth. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern well. Stanley Milgram's experiments revealed how ordinary people comply with authority even when it violates their moral instincts, not because they are cruel, but because obedience relieves them of responsibility. When truth is decided elsewhere, doubt feels dangerous. In the post-Nicene world, belief followed this same logic. Faith became something performed correctly rather than lived deeply. To repeat the creed mattered more than to wrestle with its meaning. The fear of deviation overshadowed the desire for understanding. Ancient wisdom warned against this surrender. The Hebrew prophets challenged kings. The Buddha urged disciples to test teachings through experience. Socrates insisted that an unexamined life leads to inner decay. But dogma teaches the opposite. It teaches that examination itself is the threat. Pause and notice how this operates internally. When questioning feels forbidden, curiosity does not disappear. It retreats underground. Doubt turns into guilt. Confusion turns into shame. Over time, the individual learns to silence parts of themselves to remain safe. This is how obedience reshapes the psyche. A system no longer needs constant enforcement once fear is internalized. The believer becomes their own guard. Thoughts are monitored, questions are censored before they are fully formed. Silence feels virtuous. The sacred, once intimate, now feels distant. God becomes less a presence and more a judge. Spirituality shifts from relationship to compliance. Love is overshadowed by obligation. Psychologically, this creates fragmentation. The outer self conforms, the inner self withdraws. Jung would later describe this as the splitting of the psyche, where rejected parts do not vanish but return as anxiety, repression, or blind aggression. This is the hidden cost of obedience. Faith survives, but curiosity withers. Tradition remains, but vitality fades. The structure stands, yet something essential is missing. And when inner truth is silenced long enough, it does not disappear. It waits, in shadows, in dreams, in those who will eventually refuse to obey. The invisible lineage. Even as doctrine tightened its grip and obedience reshaped the inner world, something refused to disappear. Beneath official structures, beyond creeds and councils, a quiet current continued to flow. It had no headquarters, no hierarchy, no single name. Yet it endured. This was the invisible lineage. These were the seekers who did not rebel openly, but neither did they surrender inwardly. They learned to live between worlds, outwardly compliant, inwardly free. They understood that survival required subtlety, that truth sometimes must travel disguised. Across cultures, such figures have always existed. In Sufi tradition, wisdom was often hidden in poetry and metaphor. In Zen, masters spoke in riddles to avoid fixation. In Jewish mysticism, teachings were encoded in symbols accessible only to those who sensed their depth. These were not evasions, they were protections. Psychologically, this reflects a deep instinct for preservation. When direct expression becomes dangerous, meaning migrates inward, the imagination becomes sanctuary. Silence becomes language. What cannot be said aloud is carried through gesture, story, and lived presence. Early Christian mystics followed this same pattern. They spoke of an inner light, a quiet knowing, a direct relationship with the sacred that required no permission. They gathered rarely, carefully, often in isolation. Some lived as hermits. Others blended into monasteries, carrying within them a fire that could not be extinguished. Consider what it means to safeguard truth without defending it, to live it rather than proclaim it, to trust that recognition will arise when conditions are right. This lineage did not seek power. It did not need validation. Its strength lay in continuity rather than dominance. Ideas were passed not through institutions, but through presence. A look, a phrase, a shared silence that said more than doctrine ever could. Carl Jung later observed that what consciousness represses, the unconscious preserves. Cultures function the same way. When spirituality is reduced to obedience, the soul finds other channels: dreams, art, longing, sudden awakenings that seem to come from nowhere. Pause and ask yourself where you have encountered this lineage without knowing its name. In a book that stirred something you could not explain. In a person whose presence felt grounded beyond belief. In moments of clarity that arrived uninvited. These were not accidents. They were signals. The invisible lineage never disappeared because it was never dependent on approval. It moved quietly through centuries, waiting for moments when the walls would crack. And cracks, inevitably, always appear. Because truth that lives within cannot be legislated out of existence. Forbidden gospels speak. What was buried does not remain silent forever. Centuries after the councils sealed doctrine and erased alternatives, fragments of another story began to resurface, not as rumors or legends, but as words preserved in earth and darkness, waiting patiently beyond the reach of authority. These were the forbidden gospels. They did not thunder, they whispered. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, Mary, Philip, and others presented a vision of spirituality strikingly different from the official narrative. Here, Jesus does not demand obedience. He invites awareness. He does not speak of salvation as reward, but of awakening as recognition. The emphasis is not on sin, but on forgetting, not on belief, but on seeing. One saying attributed to Jesus declares that the kingdom is not something to be awaited, nor searched for in temples or skies. It is already present, hidden in plain sight, within and around the seeker. Such words do not support hierarchy. They dissolve it. From a psychological perspective, this message is unsettling. It places responsibility back into the hands of the individual. There is no intermediary to blame, no authority to hide behind. Awakening becomes intimate and irreversible. You cannot unknow what you recognize. These texts are symbolic, layered, often paradoxical. They resist literal interpretation. That resistance is precisely why they were dangerous. Literalism is easy to control. Symbolism invites interpretation. And interpretation awakens autonomy. Ancient traditions across the world echoed this same pattern. In Zen koans, meaning breaks logic to awaken insight. In Sufi poetry, truth hides behind metaphor. In the Upanishads, the ultimate reality cannot be spoken, only realized. The forbidden gospels stand firmly within this lineage. When these writings were rediscovered in the 20th century, preserved in desert sands, They did not shock scholars because they contradicted faith. They shocked because they revealed how much had been removed. Pause and imagine generations denied access to these voices, not because they were false, but because they were uncontrollable, because they taught that the sacred does not belong to institutions. It belongs to consciousness. The Christ that emerges here is not an emperor of heaven, but a guide to inner freedom. He points inward repeatedly. He refuses to be fixed. He speaks in riddles that bypass obedience and aim directly at recognition. This is why these texts could not survive openly. They did not need armies to threaten power. They only needed to be read. And once read, they could never be unread. The feminine that had to disappear. One of the most unsettling revelations hidden within the forbidden texts is not only what they say, but who is allowed to speak. Voices once present at the center of early spiritual life slowly fade from the official story until their absence feels natural, even justified. Mary Magdalene stands at the heart of this disappearance. In several suppressed writings, she is not portrayed as a symbol of shame or repentance, but as a bearer of insight, a trusted disciple, a voice of understanding when others hesitate. She asks questions not to challenge authority, but to clarify truth, and she receives answers. This portrayal was intolerable. A spiritual tradition rooted in hierarchy cannot easily accommodate a woman who teaches without permission. A system built on control cannot afford a figure who embodies inner authority without rank. The issue was never morality. It was legitimacy. Psychologically, the suppression of the feminine reflects a broader fear. The feminine principle is associated with intuition, receptivity, embodiment, and relational knowing. These forms of understanding resist rigid categorization. They cannot be reduced to formulas. They move through experience rather than decree. Patriarchal structures depend on clarity, order, and linear authority. The feminine introduces ambiguity, cycles, fluidity. It blurs boundaries rather than enforcing them. To power structures, this feels like chaos. Across cultures, the pattern repeats. Ancient goddesses are replaced by distant male deities. Oracles are silenced. Midwives become suspects. Wisdom carried through the body is reframed as danger. What was once sacred becomes suspicious. The removal of feminine voices from spiritual leadership did not happen by accident. It was strategic. By narrowing authority to a single gender, control became simpler. Lineage could be regulated. Interpretation could be standardized. Pause and consider what is lost when half of human experience is excluded from the sacred conversation. When intuition is dismissed, spirituality becomes abstract. When embodiment is rejected, faith disconnects from life. When relationship is replaced by hierarchy, the divine feels remote rather than present. Even psychology confirms this imbalance. Carl Jung warned that cultures which repress the feminine create shadow expressions of it. Hysteria, projection, fear. What is denied does not disappear, it returns distorted. The diminished portrayal of Mary Magdalene is not merely historical, it is symbolic. It represents the broader erasure of a way of knowing that could not be controlled. But absence does not equal extinction. The feminine did not vanish, it withdrew. It survived in whispers, in care, in healing, in silence, waiting for the moment when it could be remembered again. Fear becomes a weapon. Once voices were silenced and alternatives erased, a new problem emerged for those in power. Belief could be defined, but definition alone was not enough. Memory could be edited, But silence still carried risk. As long as people remembered that other paths had once existed, obedience would never feel complete. So fear was refined. Not the sudden fear of violence, but the slow, persistent fear of stepping out of line. A fear that seeps inward and reshapes thought itself. This was far more effective than force. A person who fears internally needs no guard. Fear became instructional. It taught what questions not to ask, which thoughts to suppress before they fully formed, which curiosities were safer left unexplored. Over time, people learned not only how to behave, but how to think. Psychology shows that sustained fear narrows perception. Under threat, the mind seeks certainty. Complexity feels overwhelming. Ambiguity feels dangerous. In this state, authority appears comforting. Clear rules feel like protection. This is how submission disguises itself as safety. Religious language adapted accordingly. The sacred was framed less as presence and more as judgment. God shifted from intimate to distant, from companion to overseer. Spiritual failure was no longer ignorance or forgetting, but disobedience. And disobedience demanded consequences. Ancient traditions had warned of this transformation. In the Tao Te Ching, fear is described as a sign of imbalance, a symptom of lost harmony. In early Christian mysticism, fear was seen as separation from love. But such perspectives were quietly sidelined. Fear works best when it feels justified. Stories were crafted. Symbols were reinterpreted. Punishment was framed as mercy. Suffering was recast as purification. Those who questioned were no longer seekers, but threats to communal order. Their doubts were contagious. Their curiosity dangerous. Pause and notice how this logic still operates. When fear is normalized, cruelty becomes reasonable. When obedience is praised, conscience weakens. When safety is promised in exchange for silence, many accept the bargain without realizing what they've surrendered. This was the turning point where belief fully merged with control. Faith, once a source of inner courage, became a tool for regulating behavior. Fear ensured compliance not through constant force, but through anticipation. The believer policed themselves. And once fear is internalized, it rarely needs to be spoken aloud again. The system could now afford to wait, because when fear shapes the inner world, time itself becomes an ally. And the next phase would no longer rely on quiet pressure alone. It would institutionalize terror, the Inquisition's shadow. Fear, once planted, does not remain abstract forever. When a system senses resistance beneath the surface, it seeks a visible demonstration of power, something unmistakable, something unforgettable. This is how the shadow of the Inquisition took shape. What began as doctrine enforced through fear evolved into doctrine enforced through spectacle. The Inquisition did not appear suddenly as an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of centuries spent narrowing belief, criminalizing doubt, and training obedience. When inner silence was no longer enough, the system turned outward. Bodies replaced books as the next battleground. Officially, the purpose was purity, to protect souls, to guard truth. But psychologically, the function was intimidation. Public punishment teaches faster than argument ever could. It does not persuade, it conditions. Trials were held not to discover truth, but to demonstrate consequences. Accusations required little evidence. Rumors sufficed. Silence itself could be interpreted as guilt. Once accused, the individual was already marked. Confession was not a release. It was a formality. Pain became a language. Torture was justified as a tool for salvation. Suffering was framed as corrective love. This inversion is crucial to understand. When cruelty is wrapped in moral certainty, it no longer feels cruel to those administering it. They believe themselves righteous. Modern psychology explains this with chilling clarity. When authority sanctifies violence, individuals disconnect from empathy. Responsibility dissolves upward. I was following orders becomes I was saving souls. Public executions were not just punishments, they were lessons. Fires lit in town squares were meant to burn memory itself. Each flame carried a message. Curiosity leads here. Difference ends here. Silence is survival. Pause and imagine standing among the crowd, not as victim, but as witness. The fear would not need words. It would lodge itself in the body, in posture, in breath, in the way thoughts quietly rearrange themselves to avoid danger. This is how terror becomes cultural. Over time, the Inquisition no longer needed constant action. Its reputation did the work. People learned to censor themselves. Families warned their children. Neighbors watched neighbors. Fear spread horizontally, not just from above. The shadow outlived the institution. Even after courts dissolved, the psychological imprint remained. The association between questioning and danger became embedded in the collective mind. Generations inherited this reflex without knowing its origin. This was the true achievement of the Inquisition. Not control through fire, but control through memory. And memory, once shaped by terror, does not easily forget. Witches, healers, and the crime of knowing. As the machinery of fear expanded, it searched for figures who embodied everything it could not regulate. Those who lived outside doctrine. Those whose knowledge came not from books or councils, but from observation, intuition, and lived connection to the world. These individuals became the perfect targets. They were called witches. Behind the accusation lay a deeper truth. Many of those condemned were healers, midwives, herbalists, and keepers of ancestral wisdom. They understood the cycles of the body, the rhythms of nature, the properties of plants, the movement of seasons and stars. Their knowledge was practical, embodied, and passed quietly from one generation to the next. This kind of knowing could not be standardized. It did not require permission. It did not flow through institutions. It did not submit to hierarchy. And most dangerously, it worked. Psychologically, this threatened the emerging order on multiple levels. These figures inspired trust without authority. They healed without doctrine. They guided without hierarchy. Their presence revealed that power could exist outside sanctioned structures. So that power had to be destroyed. The image of the witch was carefully constructed. She was framed as dangerous, seductive, chaotic, aligned with darkness. Manuals were written to identify her. Confessions were extracted under torture. Any deviation from accepted behavior could be reinterpreted as proof of guilt. Independence became suspicious. Wisdom became threatening. Difference became evil. Across history, systems of control have always targeted those who embody autonomy. In ancient Greece, Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth by asking questions. In China, scholars were silenced for challenging orthodoxy. The witch hunts followed the same pattern, but with unprecedented brutality. Pause and reflect on the symbolism. The witch represented embodied knowledge. She trusted intuition. She listened to nature. She stood outside male-dominated hierarchies. Her existence alone challenged the narrative that truth must flow from above. The violence was not random. It was systematic. By eradicating these figures, the system severed humanity's relationship with a form of wisdom rooted in the body and the earth. Healing became regulated. Knowledge became abstract. Spirituality became detached from life. Yet, as with all suppressed truths, this wisdom did not vanish. It went underground. It survived in folklore, in remedies whispered between generations, in rituals disguised as tradition rather than spirituality. It lived on in the margins, waiting, because knowledge born of experience cannot be fully erased. It only learns to hide. And what hides longest often returns strongest. Mystics who refused silence. Even under the weight of persecution, there were those who could not fully contain what moved within them. They did not seek confrontation, yet neither could they deny their experience. These were the mystics. Figures who spoke not from doctrine, but from direct encounter. Mystics appear in every tradition when structures become rigid. They arise not to dismantle faith, but to remind it of its source. Their words often sound simple, even obvious, yet they unsettle authority because they bypass it entirely. Meister Eckhart spoke of a divine spark within the soul, untouched by time or sin. He suggested that God is not found through effort or obedience, but through emptying oneself of false identities. Such ideas alarmed those who relied on external control. Eckhart was accused, investigated, and condemned after his death. His teachings deemed dangerous, not because they denied God, but because they dissolved the need for mediation. Hildegard of Bingen described visions that merged music, medicine, cosmology, and spirituality. She spoke with authority derived not from rank, but from experience. Though protected by her reputation, her insights sat uneasily within rigid doctrine. They blurred lines that power preferred to keep distinct. Marguerite Porete went further. She wrote of a soul so united with the divine that it no longer required moral rules imposed from outside. This was unforgivable. Her book was burned. She was executed. Her crime was not immorality, but freedom. Psychologically, mystics threaten systems because they demonstrate autonomy without rebellion. They do not argue. They radiate. Their certainty comes not from belief, but from knowing. This kind of knowing cannot be refuted by authority because it does not depend on it. Pause and consider why such figures provoke such fear. A mystic cannot be controlled through reward or punishment. Fear loses its leverage. Guilt dissolves. Obedience becomes irrelevant. The individual stands grounded in direct experience. Across cultures, the pattern repeats. Sufi poets were imprisoned. Zen masters were exiled. Indigenous visionaries were silenced. Whenever inner authority emerges, external authority feels exposed. Yet mystics rarely sought to overthrow anything. They spoke in metaphors, poems, paradoxes. They trusted that recognition would arise naturally. Their language aimed not to convince, but to awaken. Though many were silenced, their words survived, copied secretly, remembered quietly, passed through time like embers carried in the dark. Because while institutions can punish voices, they cannot extinguish experience. And experience, once known, leaves a mark no fire can erase. When science became heresy, there came a moment when questioning the heavens became as dangerous as questioning God, not because curiosity was new, but because it began to reveal a universe far larger, freer, and less controllable than doctrine allowed. For centuries, the cosmos had been presented as fixed and orderly, arranged to mirror authority on Earth, a centered world, a ranked universe, everything in its proper place. This image supported more than theology. It reinforced hierarchy, certainty, and human centrality. Then observation disrupted the picture. Early astronomers and natural philosophers did not seek to destroy faith. Many were deeply spiritual. They believed the universe itself was a sacred text, written not in words, but in patterns. To study nature was, for them, an act of reverence. But reverence without permission is threatening. Giordano Bruno embodied this danger. He imagined an infinite universe filled with countless worlds, each animated by the same divine presence. In his vision, God was not confined to a distant throne, but expressed everywhere, in every star, in every form. This dissolved the neat separation between creator and creation that authority depended on. Bruno's ideas were not only scientific, they were spiritual, and that made them intolerable. If the universe has no center, then no institution can claim it. If the divine is everywhere, then no authority can monopolize access to it. Bruno was imprisoned for years, pressured to recant, and eventually executed. His body was destroyed, but the questions he raised could not be undone. A few decades later, Galileo turned a telescope toward the sky and confirmed what intuition and mathematics had already suggested: moons orbiting other planets, phases of Venus, a moving Earth. These were not opinions, they were visible. Yet visibility did not protect him. The issue was never evidence, it was implication. A moving Earth meant a moving worldview. It meant humanity was not the fixed center. It meant Scripture could not be read as literal cosmology. It meant authority had limits. Psychologically, this was destabilizing. When long-held certainties collapse, fear arises. Rather than adapt, systems often resist. Galileo was forced to recant, not because his observations were false, but because they were disruptive. Pause and consider the pattern. When discovery expands understanding, power feels threatened. When knowledge grows beyond control, it is labeled dangerous. Science becomes heresy not when it denies meaning, but when it removes the need for imposed meaning. Bruno and Galileo were not enemies of the sacred. They were explorers of it. Their crime was refusing to stop looking. And once looking begins, it cannot be commanded to end. Galileo and the crime of seeing. Galileo's greatest offense was not what he said, but what he saw, and more importantly, that he invited others to see it too. The telescope did something no decree could undo. It shifted authority from inherited certainty to direct observation. Anyone willing to look could verify what had once been unthinkable. The sky was no longer a painted ceiling fixed in place. It was dynamic, imperfect, alive. This is why the reaction was so severe. Power can tolerate abstract disagreement. It struggles with visible contradiction. When belief rests on interpretation, authority can argue. When reality itself speaks, argument collapses. Galileo did not shout his findings as rebellion. He presented them as inquiry, as curiosity, as wonder. Yet wonder itself became suspect. The idea that the universe did not revolve around humanity threatened more than theology. It threatened identity. Psychology tells us that when core assumptions are challenged, the mind reacts defensively. Cognitive dissonance arises. Rather than revise beliefs, many choose to protect them at all costs. Institutions behave no differently. They defend their worldview as if their survival depends on it, because it does. The trial of Galileo was staged as correction, but it functioned as warning. He was not burned, but he was broken publicly, forced to renounce what he knew to be true, condemned to silence under watchful eyes. His submission was meant to teach obedience, not to resolve truth. Yet even in silence, truth persists. The famous phrase attributed to him, that the earth still moves, whether spoken or not, became a symbol, not of defiance, but of inevitability. Reality does not require agreement. It continues regardless of permission. Pause and reflect on what this reveals. The crime was never seeing something new. It was trusting what was seen more than what was commanded. Observation placed authority back into human perception, not hierarchy. This moment reshaped the future quietly. While institutions resisted, the seed was planted. Science would continue. Knowledge would expand. What was once forbidden would eventually become obvious. The tragedy is not that Galileo suffered. It is that such suffering was required to preserve an illusion of control. His story mirrors countless others. Whenever insight threatens a fixed order, it is framed as danger. Yet time consistently sides with those who observe honestly. Because truth does not need defenders. It needs witnesses. And once witnessed, it waits patiently until the world is ready to see it too. Modern dogma wears new clothes. When the flames died and the tribunals faded into history, it appeared as though the age of enforced belief had ended. But power rarely abandons its methods, it refines them. What once ruled through visible fear learned to operate through subtler forms of control. Modern dogma no longer announces itself as sacred. It presents itself as neutral. Truth is now framed as consensus. Authority wears the language of objectivity. Instead of councils, there are institutions. Instead of creeds, there are narratives. Instead of heresy, there is dismissal. To question is no longer sinful, but irresponsible, ignorant, or dangerous. Psychologically, this is far more effective. Social conformity does not require chains when approval and belonging are at stake. Studies in behavioral psychology show that humans fear social exclusion more than physical punishment. When acceptance depends on repeating sanctioned views, many comply without resistance. Silence becomes survival once again. Algorithms decide what is seen. Headlines shape perception. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity is mistaken for truth. What cannot be easily categorized is marginalized. What challenges the dominant frame is labeled extreme. The old mechanisms remain intact, only updated. Even spirituality has not escaped this transformation. Many modern movements promise liberation while quietly installing new orthodoxies. Gurus replace bishops. Techniques replace creeds. Certainty returns, disguised as enlightenment. Those who question are told they are not ready, not awakened enough, not aligned. The pattern is unmistakable. In science, exploration thrives until it threatens funding, status, or established paradigms. Then skepticism hardens into gatekeeping. In politics, complexity is flattened into slogans. In education, curiosity is sacrificed for standardization. The structure changes. The logic does not. Pause and observe how often dissent is framed not as dialogue, but as threat. How quickly disagreement becomes character judgment. How easily questioning is mistaken for malice. This is not progress or regression. It is continuity. The same impulse that once burned books now buries ideas under noise. The same fear that once punished doubt now drowns it in ridicule. The modern heretic is not executed. They are ignored, deplatformed, or erased from relevance. And yet, just as before, something persists beneath the surface. Those who still ask without seeking permission, those who sense that truth cannot be owned, those who refuse to trade inner clarity for social safety. They are not loud, they are awake, and they carry forward the same lineage that has survived every empire before this one. Because control may adapt, but consciousness does not obey. It remembers. The return of inner freedom. After centuries of suppression, distortion, and fear, something remarkable remains. Not a doctrine, not an institution, but a quiet certainty that refuses to disappear. The knowing that truth cannot be owned, controlled, or permanently silenced. Inner freedom has always survived in the margins. It appears whenever someone pauses long enough to listen inwardly. Whenever a question is asked without fear of punishment. Whenever meaning is felt rather than inherited. This freedom does not announce itself. It does not recruit. It does not demand belief. It simply awakens. Across history, every system built on control eventually collapses under its own weight. Empires fade, dogmas fracture, certainties lose their grip. What endures is not structure, but consciousness. The capacity to see, to feel, to know without permission. Ancient wisdom has always pointed here. The Buddha spoke of liberation through awareness. The Upanishads describe the realization that the seeker and the sought are one. Mystics across traditions whispered the same truth in different languages. What you are looking for has never been outside you. Psychologically, this moment of recognition is transformative. Responsibility returns to the individual. Fear loosens its hold. Guilt dissolves. Meaning no longer depends on approval. Viktor Frankl observed that when a person finds meaning within, no external force can take it away. Inner freedom cannot be threatened because it does not rely on circumstance. This is why it has always been dangerous to power. A person rooted in inner clarity does not require coercion or reward. They are less susceptible to manipulation. They can participate in traditions without becoming trapped by them. They can honor symbols without mistaking them for the source. They can respect structures without surrendering their conscience. Pause now and notice what resonates within you. Not what convinces you, not what sounds right, but what feels quietly familiar. That recognition is not new, it is remembered. The return of inner freedom does not mean rejecting the past. It means seeing it clearly, honoring wisdom without submitting to fear, understanding belief without abandoning curiosity, living spirituality as presence rather than performance. This freedom is not loud. It does not seek followers. It moves through ordinary lives, through moments of honesty, through courage expressed in small, decisive acts. It spreads not by force, but by resonance. And once awakened, it cannot be undone. Because the greatest heresy was never questioning doctrine. It was forgetting yourself. Now that remembering has begun again,